With a rush of blood to the political head, the minister of the day, the aforementioned King O'Malley, took it upon himself to be the final arbiter of the competition. Upset over the adequacy of the prizes offered to the winner and place-getters, and incensed by O'Malley's presumption of the ultimate say, the local institutes of architects and their brothers in Britain leaned on their members to boycott the competition. Inevitably, Griffin's winning entry would often be viewed as no more than the best in a poor and depleted field. O'Malley's bureaucrats, a so-called departmental board, Percy Owen and the department secretary, the regimentally upright Colonel David Miller, principal amongst them, then presumed a licence to cherry-pick from the highest-placed designs, Griffin's and several others, literally taking a park from one, a boulevard from another, and so on. Affecting savings in a never-defined budget was touted as a motivation, but their deliberations also suited O'Malley's contrary instincts. Why back a single scheme when a 2-bob each way bet was politically safer? The resulting plan proved to be as laughably muddled as it was divisive and unfortunate. British town planner and critic Patrick Abercrombie described the board's creation as outside the pale of serious criticism, a third-rate Luna Park or the Christmas production of a toy factory. In the Australian idiom, it was comparable to that poor maligned camel, the horse, designed by a committee. And to modern eyes, looking at a comparison, as you can see on the screen, between the departmental board's plan and Griffin's plan, you just scratch your head and wonder what they were up to. Yet it was on the basis of the departmental board's plan that construction actually commenced on the capital site. It took a change of government in May 1913 and Griffin's first visit to Australia 3 months later to see the board disbanded, their work overthrown and Griffin's scheme tenuously returned to the ascendant. These were fragile gains that Griffin would never maintain. The temporarily humiliated Owen and Miller would see to that in the relentless defence of their bureaucratic fiefdoms. Such a plainly resented presence as Griffin's required a nimble and determined phalanx of defenders. His supporters within the Parliament could not always be relied upon for protection, as they themselves were subject to the fortunes of a particularly turbulent period in the young nation's political life. He held an implacable belief in the correctness of his ideas, and no one was ever more determined than Griffin to see these ideas realised. He would not otherwise have managed to become so deeply embroiled in this great saga. But he lacked the essential ability to preempt or second-guess his opponents. Griffin was neither a diplomat, nor a manipulator, nor an effective strategist suited to an Australian political landscape where, in his direct dealings with the government, he had to work with no fewer than 5 ministers with responsibility for the capital project. Similarly, 4 Prime Ministers, Fisher twice, Cook and Hughes, each led governments with radically shifting priorities in handling the capital's development from 1912 to 1920. If all that were not enough to test Griffin's equanimity, in the midst of such turmoil came the worst blow of all, a world war. The nation's energies were immediately swung behind the imperial cause, and the vital conditions for the orderly development of a great symbol of national sentiment simply evaporated. On a personal level, as outsiders and especially Americans, citizens of a nation unwilling to take up the cudgels until late in the war, Walter and Marion found that attitudes toward them only hardened. Within their own profession, the Griffins' espousal of the great Louis Sullivan's rallying call for a new architecture devoid of historic precedent was at first met with curiosity, but was soon replaced by puzzlement and indifference. And from their own quarter, neither Walter nor Marion ever courted the institutes or sought the embrace of the local profession. Perhaps life might have been easier had they done so. From 1915 onwards, as their buildings began to appear in Melbourne, the wider public was, in the wonderful Robin Boyd's whimsical words, a little bewildered, but still prepared to believe that Griffin's buildings could not be as mad as they looked, because, after all, the man had come from America. But of those who considered themselves the public arbiters of architectural tastes, their response to the Griffins' architecture soon took on a manic edge. Almost overnight, two of their most energetic champions, the remarkable and meddlesome publishing and duo and town planning advocates, George and Florence Taylor, became their most strident and at times vicious critics. The Taylors and the Griffins were alike in certain respects. Both couples were thoroughly modern working duos, and linked to their mutual planning interests, there was an undoubted early connection. In 1913, George Taylor had crowed in the pages of his trade journal Building that Griffin is the rebel I have been waiting for. And through their various publications, George and Florence championed the new movement in architecture, particularly as it emanated from Chicago. In George's words, Griffin is a protagonist, possessed to the full of that freedom of thought and action which harmonises so admirably with the aims and aspirations of this free and maturing nation, Australia, the country with the clean sheet. But following a 1914 study tour of North America, during which the Taylors met a baleful Wright, eternally bitter over what he saw as the plagiarism of his erstwhile followers, the outbreak of a war for which the Americans had no stomach, and the refusal of the Griffins to aid and abet George and Florence's attempts at influence peddling over the capital project, the relationship between the two couples soon came dramatically unstuck. The Griffins' first contribution to Melbourne architecture took the form of a bold reinforced concrete rear facade to the extensions to Collins House at 381 Little Collins Street. And, as if on cue, the Taylors opened fire in the December 1915 edition of Building, describing Collins House as now having an imperialist front and an anarchist back. They next attacked the wondrously escapist and tragically long demolished Café Australia, again in Collins Street. Among a litany of failings, Florence Taylor simply saw the cafe's gorgeous expanses of decorative plasterwork as vermin haunts, and its sumptuously exotic street frontage as resembling an entrance to a coal cellar. With the war mired in blood in Europe and the Australian press draped with the innocent faces of the nation's dead youth, the Griffins never disguised pacifist sympathies enraged the likes of the Taylors. Their journals seethed with attacks on American and German city planning models, while George's adroitly drawn cartoons shouted a base message: Americans were as good as the enemy. While never actually naming the Griffins, slights such as the following left no doubting their target. If the Huns went through Illinois and left 4,000 outraged women in their wake, where would America's non-resistant policy stand? George asked contemptuously. Remarkably, amidst all the acrid smoke of wartime abuse, the Griffins built one of their masterpieces, the Catholic Newman College at the University of Melbourne. Owing no allegiance to the great traditions of ecclesiastical design, Newman College nevertheless managed to impart what a favourable contemporary commentator, for once, described as an effect of pure and gracious serenity. Of course, the Griffin's design again drew Florence Taylor's ire. To her, the building was subversive, dangerous to all architectural principles of truth in design and faithfulness in construction. And with its perceived disrespect for the Gothic tradition, the college's wealthy Sydney benefactor, Thomas Donovan, joined her in the attacks. Apart from its shunning of the medieval, Donovan seemed particularly disturbed that the layout and amenity of the college would, and I quote, plunge our poor boys into a vortex of luxury which is bound to turn their heads to evil. 2 rooms each, sunken baths, hot water in their rooms, electric fans, heat radiators, pneumatic tubes, I'm not sure what they were to be used for, and whatnot. Luxuries, I know, are not allowed at Eton or Oxford, even to the sons of our king. Malicious carping over the Griffin's architecture was one thing, and it must be pointed out that other innovative architects, Robert Haddon for instance, were not immune from their abuse, but the Taylors went further where the Griffins were concerned. At times they attempted to discredit Walter back home in Chicago, and they also gathered supposed evidence from the likes of Frank Lloyd Wright to undermine his standing before the government here. It was behaviour that greatly disturbed the otherwise perennially sanguine Walter. When researching and writing this book, I was at times moved to a feeling of shame by the behaviour of many among previous generations of Australia. And as we've seen tonight, there are moments in the Griffin story that do not make for comfortable reading. I often found myself shaking my head in incredulity and thinking, if only it were different. Not that the Griffins were always right, and my depiction of them is, I assure you, no exercise in hagiography. But arising from all their struggles and difficulties, there is another brighter side, at least for the benefit of our time. That the Griffins endured years of derision and exclusion, yet remained energetic and engaged, building and dreaming, imagining, creating and hoping, is of itself an inspiring story for all who seek a better world. Florence Taylor, herself an outside in a professional sense and excluded on account of her sex alone, eventually became the first Australian woman to be admitted to membership of one of the state institutes of architects. On the northern outskirts of modern Canberra, the new suburb of Taylor commemorates this fact among a string of her achievements. Justified perhaps. Yet, at a distance of nearly 100 years, such an epitaph seems like a cruel jibe to the Griffin's legacy in Australia. Why in Canberra, of all places? Sadly, there is no civic recognition anywhere within the bounds of the capital today that celebrates the great contribution Marion Marnie Griffin made to the city of the imagination. Similarly, Lake Burley Griffin, with its shoreline delineated in supposed economies by Walter's enemies and bearing no respect for his more formal concepts, is but a muted recognition of one man's thwarted attempt to realise his vision splendid. Despite a steady rise in recent years in scholarly and popular interest in the Griffins, and increasing respect for their contribution to Australian life in the early 20th century, I feel we must do more to bring these two outsiders in from the cold. I'll end my remarks where I began, in this great theatre of the imagination, and I must say it is just such a thrill to present this talk in in this masterpiece of a space. After the 7 years of struggle and slander that was Canberra, the capital proved to be a place of professional and personal renewal for Walter and Marion. Its realisation was obviously not without its difficulties, but in this 85-year-old theatre we can see emphatic proof of how art can triumph over mediocrity. In the late 1940s, Robin Boyd was the first architect with a foot in our generation to appreciate the great contribution made to Australia by the Griffins. Like many Melburnians, he came to this theatre as a child and was instantly enraptured by the light show overhead. Later, as an eminent practitioner, he, true to his era, became an adherent of the less is more principle of modernism, and the ceiling's intricacies became something of a guilty pleasure. But to Boyd, as magnificent as the ceiling was, the capital's transcendent genius lay in the flow and manipulation of space. From the seductively curved stairs and ceiling of the lobby to the great void in the upper lounge that allowed patrons to look down on the crowd below, there was an interlacing and merging of spaces in a charged spatial pattern that defied photography or description. For Boyd, the Capitol was simply one of the most important Australian buildings of the century. Almost lost to the forces of expediency in the 1960s, the Capitol, of course, lives on as a vibrant part of the Griffins' legacy in Australia. In 1961, just a few years before the Robin Boyd orchestrated campaign to save the building gathered strength, Marion died in humble circumstances in Chicago at the age of 90. Walter had died in India 24 years before, and so departed the other half of the whole that was the Griffins. In their eventful lives together, Walter and Marion had bestrode 3 continents, absorbing the wonder and magic in each environment, teaching, bewitching, badgering and cajoling all those with whom they mixed, never resiling from a belief that there is a better way for the individual, for communities, for humankind, and ultimately for the planet. We need the spirit of Walter and Marion more now than they could ever have imagined. Thank you.